Struggling widower saved lone survivor of a wagon massacre, unaware she was a baroness who gave him love. Snow pressed down from a gray October sky, heavy and soundless, muffling the ridges and gulches of the frontier as if the land itself were holding its breath. Jacob McGraw urged his bay gelding along the frozen trail, shoulders hunched against the cutting wind, a burlap sack of salt and flour strapped behind the saddle. His eyes, pale as weathered steel, scanned the timberline the way they always did, a habit born of years living alone and of the grief that had hollowed him into vigilance. He had buried his wife 2 winters past, beside a cottonwood marked with a simple cross, and ever since, every mile of land seemed emptier, each silence longer, every shadow longer still. The gelding tossed its head, nostrils flaring. Jacob felt it then too, an acrid bite in the wind, not just wood smoke, but something harsher. He slowed the horse to a walk. The snow bore new scars, churned tracks, half-frozen blood speckled on drifts, broken branches littered across the path. The smell thickened as he rode on, until it seemed to cling to his beard and coat. When the trail bent, his gut clenched. The wreckage sprawled before him, an entire wagon, canvas charred and frame splintered, horses lying stiff where they had fallen. Snow fell softly over them, failing to cover the violence done here. Jacob slid from the saddle, boots sinking into the red-stained crust. The silence was wrong. Not the natural hush of winter woods, but the aftermath of screams swallowed by sky. He crouched near the wheel, touched a broken spoke still warm with ash. The ground bore prints, men's boots, a dozen at least, hammering off toward the ridges. Outlaws. They had stripped what they wanted and fled, leaving only ruin. Jacob swallowed hard, jaw tightening. He had seen killings before, border skirmishes, rustlers shot down, but this was slaughter, deliberate and merciless. He rose, scanning the wreck, every muscle taut. The dead told no tales, yet sometimes the land whispered what the killers overlooked. A sound pierced through, faint, brittle as ice cracking. A whimper. Jacob froze, turning slowly toward the wagon's underside. He dropped to one knee, pulled aside a half-burned tarp. There, half buried in ash and snow, lay a woman. Her dress, once fine, was shredded, silk darkened with soot and blood. Pale skin bore bruises, a cut above her temple seeped sluggishly, and her lips trembled blue with cold. In her hand, clasped with desperate strength, gleamed a silver locket etched with a crest. Her eyes fluttered open at the draught of cold air, revealing depths of gray-green, glazed yet burning with a will to cling. "Help!" she rasped, the word broken by frost. Jacob's chest tightened. He slid his arms under her, surprised by how light she felt, as if life itself were already slipping away. She tried to resist at first, a feeble protest, as though she feared another captor, but then collapsed against his chest. He wrapped his coat around her, heart pounding with the urgency that had no name but duty. The gelding stamped nearby, nervous at the smell of blood. Jacob mounted with the woman cradled against him, her breath faint against his throat. He pressed his heels and the horse surged forward, hooves striking sparks from stone hidden under the snow. The wind cut sharper as they climbed into the timber, and the woman stirred, whispering in a tongue not his own, French if his ears remembered right. The syllables carried sorrow even without understanding. Her hand clutched the locket tighter, knuckles white, as though its weight anchored her to this world. Jacob murmured low, steadying, though he doubted she heard. Darkness gathered early. The storm thickened, snow veiling the ridges in sheets. Each mile grew longer, the horse laboring, Jacob's arms burning with strain as he held her close to shield her from the bitter air. He could feel the tremors of fever beneath her skin, the shallow stutter of breath. Every minute mattered. At last the outline of his cabin emerged through the blur of falling snow, a squat shape of logs against the hillside, smoke barely curling from the chimney. Relief caught in his throat, sharp as grief itself. He pushed the gelding harder, slid from the saddle before the horse fully stopped, and shouldered the door open with his weight. Warmth rushed out, faint but real, from the banked fire he had left that morning. He carried her inside, lowering her gently onto the bearskin rug by the hearth. She stirred, eyes flicking open to the sudden glow of firelight. For a moment she looked around wild-eyed, uncertain if she'd been delivered from death or into another danger. Jacob crouched beside her, voice rough but steady. You're safe. For now. He stripped his coat and hung it near the fire, then moved with practiced efficiency, laying out blankets, pouring water from the kettle, tearing strips of cloth for bandages. The years alone had taught him such rituals. He had stitched his own flesh after barbed wire, buried calves in snow, tended fever until dawn. Now those same hands trembled slightly as he pressed a damp cloth to her temple. She flinched, then slowly eased as the warmth seeped into her. Her gaze lingered on him, searching, measuring the lines of his face, the grief carved there. "Who are you?" Her voice cracked, almost lost beneath the fire's pop. "Jacob," he said simply. "Just a rancher." Her lips parted as though to say more, but strength fled. She turned her face slightly, hair matted with soot, and whispered, "Merci." Then her eyes closed. Jacob sat back on his heels, staring at her pale features softened by flickering light. Whoever she was, she bore the marks of a world far from this frozen cabin. That locket gleamed even now in her limp hand, a sign of wealth or lineage. Yet out here, none of that mattered. Not against hunger, not against cold, not against men who carved massacres into the snow. He leaned forward, fed the fire with fresh logs until the room blazed warm, shadows leaping across the walls. Outside, the storm howled, pressing against shutters, filling every crack with ice. Within, her breath steadied, shallow but stubborn, tethering her to life. Jacob rose, crossing to the door, and pressed his ear to the wood. The wind carried no hoofbeats now, but he knew the kind of men who left a trail of bodies behind. They would not forgive a survivor. They would come hunting. He set the iron bar across the door, checked the rifle leaning by the hearth, and drew in a long breath. He had taken in more than a wounded stranger tonight. He had taken on a fight that might well bring death back to his doorstep. When he returned to the rug, the woman shifted faintly in her sleep, murmuring words he did not understand, her fingers tightening around the locket as if it were life itself. Jacob lowered himself onto the stool nearby, the fire warming one side of his face, the storm's chill seeping through the other. He watched her breathe, the rise and fall fragile as the flames flicker. The night deepened. Snow thickened against the roof, the wind keened like spirits circling the ridge. In that lonely cabin, with only the fire and the wounded stranger to keep him company, Jacob McGraw realized that his life had shifted in a single hour. He had pulled a woman out of a grave, and with her came danger he could not yet see but already felt in his bones. Her eyelids fluttered once more, and in a voice thin as a reed, she whispered, "They will not stop." Then sleep claimed her again. Jacob's hand closed over the rifle stock, knuckles white. The fire snapped loud, echoing her words in the silence. He stared into the blaze, the storm rattling outside, and knew the night had only begun. Morning seeped into the cabin slowly, pale light filtering through frost-laced shutters, dimming the fire's orange glow. Jacob McGraw stirred from the chair where he had slept upright, rifle leaned against his leg, boots still on. His neck ached, but it was not discomfort that drew him awake. It was the faint shift of the woman's breath, the fragile stirring of someone pulled halfway back from the brink. She was lying where he had set her, bundled in his spare quilt, her lashes trembling against cheeks that no longer looked as death-pale as the night before. The cut on her temple had dried into a dark line. Her lips still cracked but warmer now, touched by the fire's breath. Jacob moved carefully, adding another log to the embers until flames licked upward again. The pop of sap cracked the silence. Her eyes opened, unsteady at first, as though light itself pained her. When they settled, she saw him crouched nearby, and her fingers clutched instinctively for the silver locket at her chest. Only when she found it there did her hand relax slightly. "You're alive," Jacob said, his voice quiet, gravel worn down by long years of disuse. The woman blinked at him, searching his face. Her voice came thin, yet with a faint accent that marked her as from far beyond these hills. "Where?" "My cabin. North Ridge." He poured water from the kettle into a tin cup, then bent to lift her gently by the shoulders. "Easy now." He held the cup to her lips. She drank greedily, then coughed, but color returned faintly to her cheeks. "Merci," she whispered. The word brushed against him oddly, foreign, yet filled with gratitude deeper than its sound. He set the cup aside, studying her. She looked young still, though hardship had carved lines of exhaustion around her eyes. Her gown, though ruined by smoke and blood, bore remnants of lace finer than anything common folk wore west of the Missouri. The locket gleamed, its filigree too delicate to belong to anyone poor. "You'll need rest," he said. "You're safe for now." Safe. He had spoken it, though he wasn't sure it was truth. The storm outside had not broken. Snow still tapped steady on the roof, sifting in fine powder around the window frame. Jacob rose, pulling on his coat, and stepped out to tend chores. The air bit like knives, his beard frosting at once. Chickens huddled silent, cattle restless in the lean-to. He worked quickly, tossing hay, breaking ice in troughs, every motion practiced from years of solitude. Yet his mind lingered on the woman inside, as though each breath of hers was tethered to his own. When he returned, she had shifted slightly, eyes half closed, watching the fire. He noticed then that she had drawn the quilt higher not out of cold but out of modesty, a reflex even in weakness. Respecting it, Jacob busied himself with the stove, dropping beans into a pot, the smell of wood smoke and iron filling the small cabin. She spoke at last, voice hushed. "You risk much, bringing me here." Jacob glanced at her. "Couldn't leave you there." Her gaze lingered on him as if weighing the truth in his tone. He kept his eyes on the pot, stirring slowly. Words came harder for him than sweat. Action was easier than speech. When he set a bowl before her, she lifted the spoon with trembling fingers. The first mouthful seemed almost too much for her, yet she pressed on, determination visible even in something so small as swallowing soup. Jacob watched from his chair, not intruding, yet something tightened in his chest. She was no ordinary victim. She carried pride even in frailty. As days passed, their silence grew less hollow. Morning after morning, Jacob would rise to tend stock, return to find her awake, sometimes humming faintly as she mended a tear in the quilt or warmed her hands around tea. The melody she hummed was soft, lilting, and though he did not know the words, it stirred something like memory, a ghost of gentleness he had thought buried with his wife. Once, when she tried to stand too soon, Jacob caught her arm before she fell. Their eyes locked, and in that brief grip she felt the raw strength beneath his calloused hand, while he saw the fire behind her fatigue. She straightened, pride flickering, but gave him the faintest nod of thanks. Snow deepened outside, blanketing the ridges. The world shrank to the size of the cabin, its chores, its silences. Jacob had not shared his fire with another soul in years. Now each evening he found himself listening for her quiet breath by the hearth, watching her eyes trace the flicker of flames as though trying to anchor herself to the present. One night, she asked softly, "Do you have family?" He hesitated. "Had a wife. Fever took her." Her gaze softened. "I am sorry." He nodded, nothing more, but the air between them shifted. Shared loss had a language no words could fully voice. Another evening, when he returned from cutting wood, he found her at the table, sleeves rolled to bandaged arms, peeling potatoes with a knife she had insisted on wielding. She looked up, weary yet resolute. "I must help. I cannot just take." Jacob set the logs down, studied her a moment. The image struck him, this woman, clearly from wealth, clinging to dignity by doing the simplest task in his cabin. He only said, "Don't overdo it." She smiled faintly, almost defiant. "I am not porcelain." That night they shared a meal not just of food but of silence less heavy, touched with warmth. Jacob found himself speaking more than usual, about the land, the early snow, the way cattle grew restless before storms. She listened, eyes intent, as though each word was a piece of the country she needed to learn to survive. Her name came later, revealed without flourish. "Isabel," she said simply when he asked. The syllables lingered in the air like a bell note, unfamiliar yet fitting. He repeated it quietly, and she looked at him with something like relief, as though hearing it on another's tongue made her reel again. The storm worsened near the end of October. Wind rattled the shutters. Snow drifted high against the door. Jacob reinforced beams, checked his rifle more often. At night he would see shadows shifting across the snow, perhaps just wolves, perhaps not. The massacre's memory lingered like a brand. One dawn, Isabel walked to the threshold, quilt wrapped around her shoulders. She stood long, staring at the horizon where the storm clouds bruised the sky. Jacob joined her, the cold cutting his lungs. "They will come back," she whispered, voice steady but low. He turned to her. She had not spoken of the attack until now. Her eyes fixed on the ridges, not on him. Men like that, they do not leave loose ends. I saw their faces. Jacob felt a weight settle into his gut. He had known it, deep down, but hearing her say it gave it form. He studied her profile, the bruises fading, the cut healing, but her gaze sharper than before. She was not only survivor, she was a witness, and that made her dangerous to them. "Then we'll be ready," he said. She turned to him then, and in her eyes flickered both fear and trust. "You saved me once. But they—" Her hand closed around the locket. "They will not stop until I am gone." Jacob met her gaze without flinching. He had lived years in silence, grief gnawing him hollow. But now, with her here, the silence was broken. For the first time in a long while, he felt the weight of another life pressing against his own, demanding he stand taller. The wind shrieked against the cabin walls, snow lifting in whirls. Isabel pulled the quilt tighter. "Then we must not wait for them to find us unprepared." Her words lingered like the storm itself. Jacob gripped the rifle stock where it leaned by the door, the iron cold beneath his palm. Outside, the wilderness stretched vast and merciless. Inside, 2 lives had been bound by chance and blood. The fire crackled behind them, the storm keened, and in that moment both knew their reprieve was fragile. Safety was an illusion, already thinning. Isabel turned her face toward him, eyes resolute, voice trembling yet fierce. "Promise me, if they come, I will not die alone in the snow." Jacob did not answer with words. He simply laid his hand gently atop hers, steady, solid, carrying the weight of vow unspoken. The wind howled harder, as though echoing her fear. Somewhere beyond the ridge, perhaps already closer than they knew, boots could be breaking snow. The cabin, warm and fragile, felt suddenly like a lantern in a dark wilderness. And lanterns, Jacob knew, always drew predators near. Frost thickened along the window's edge, lace-like patterns that shimmered when the firelight flickered. Jacob sat sharpening his knife, steady strokes of stone against steel the only sound in the cabin besides Isabel's quiet breathing. She sat at the table, shawl over her shoulders, staring into the flames as though they carried scenes only she could see. The silence had a different weight tonight, no longer just the hush of winter pressing against the walls, but something fuller, charged, waiting. She broke it at last, her voice soft, almost hesitant, as if parting with each word cost her strength. "You wonder who I am." Jacob didn't raise his eyes from the blade, but he paused in his work, the rhythm stilled. "Reckon I do." Her hands folded around the locket. The silver gleamed, etched with a crest he'd never seen. "My name is Isabel Lauron. My father is Baron Edouard Lauron, of Lyon." She spoke it not with pride but with weariness, as though the title weighed heavy rather than lifted. "He invested in lands here, rich soil, great stretches of cattle country. I was sent with a party of men to survey, to represent his interests." Her breath caught. She blinked hard, but grief slipped through the cracks. "Those men, they were loyal, kind. They are gone because of me." Jacob set the knife down, leaned forward. "They're gone because men without honor crossed their path. Don't lay that weight on yourself." She met his gaze then, and for the first time since he had pulled her from ash and snow, he saw the woman not only as a survivor but as someone carrying the burden of wealth, station, and now guilt. The locket trembled in her fingers. "The Coulter Gang. That is what they called themselves. I saw the one who led them. His face." She shuddered. "I will not forget." The name landed heavy. Jacob had heard it in town whispers, warnings traded by trappers. Coulter and his men robbed, murdered, left nothing but smoke behind. If they knew she lived, they would come. A knock at the cabin wall startled them both. Jacob rose at once, hand going to his rifle. Outside, a voice called, muffled by snow and wood. "McGraw, that you in there?" It was old Jonas Pike, A trapper who came through once a month, trading pelts for coffee or bullets. Jacob eased the bar aside, cracked the door. Snow swirled around a hunched figure, beard iced white, eyes sharp beneath a fur hat. Evenin', Jonas. Jonas stamped his boots, glancing past Jacob's shoulder. Heard gunfire 2 nights back. And word out of town says Coulter's been spotted South Ridge, near the old mining cut. You best keep your stock close. Jacob felt Isabel stiffen behind him. Appreciate the warning. Jonas leaned in, lowering his voice. They're huntin' someone. Some say a woman. You'd know anything about that? His eyes narrowed, not unkind, but curious. Jacob held his gaze a long beat. All I know is the snow's deeper than it ought to be. Jonas studied him, then nodded once, pulling his coat tighter. Well, keep your rifle near. Wolves walk on 2 legs as often as 4 these days. With that, he trudged off into the white dusk. Jacob barred the door again. When he turned, Isabel was standing, quilt clutched to her chest, face pale but resolved. It is me they hunt. I told you, they will not stop. Her admission drew the air tight between them. Jacob crossed to her slowly. Then we don't let them find you unready. The next days turned into a rhythm of preparation. Jacob checked the cabin shutters, reinforced beams, cut more wood than he thought he'd need. He set traps along the tree line, not just for game but as warning snares should men approach. Isabel insisted on learning. He showed her how to prime the small pistol he kept wrapped in oilcloth. Her hands trembled, but her jaw was set. One afternoon she asked him, "Have you killed before?" He hesitated, eyes on the rifle he was cleaning. Had to. Rustlers once. Couple Kiowa raids back in the day. Not proud of it, but proud I'm still here. She nodded, running her finger along the locket. I never touched a gun before this land. In France, we fought with words, with laws, with gold. Out here, none of that matters. Jacob looked at her then, really looked, the proud line of her posture despite bruises, the way she wore his late wife's shawl not as borrowed pity but as armor. Out here, what matters is will. And you've got it. Her eyes glistened at his words, not with weakness but with a kind of fragile gratitude. I thought I was nothing without what I left behind. But now, I only wish to live. To see another sunrise. That night the wind screamed through the chimney. Isabel sat close to the fire, brushing her hair with a carved wooden comb she had found on his shelf. Jacob watched from the table. The image burned into him. The simple act of a woman reclaiming her dignity after death had nearly claimed her. Then, in the hush between gusts, came another sound. A long, low whistle drifting from the timber. Not wind. Not wolf. A man's signal. Jacob rose, rifle already in hand, moving to the window slit. Snow blurred the trees, but in the shifting white he caught movement, shadows slipping between pines, deliberate, too tall for animals. He counted 3, maybe more, before the storm swallowed them again. He turned back. Isabel had frozen mid-breath, eyes wide, lips parted. She whispered, "They found us." The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney. Jacob crossed to her, steady, calm despite the thundering in his chest. "Then we hold. You stay low. Do as I tell you." She nodded, clutching the pistol with both hands, her knuckles bloodless. The night dragged long, the cabin pressed by storm and silence. No attack came, not yet. Perhaps they were testing, circling, letting fear gnaw first. Jacob stayed awake by the window, every sense sharpened, Isabel a silent shadow by the hearth. Toward dawn, when the snow eased, he saw tracks cut clear across the yard, boot prints deep, circling the cabin like wolves marking prey. They hadn't struck, but they had sent a message. We are here, and we are waiting. Jacob's stomach clenched with grim certainty. The fight he had feared was no longer some distant threat. It crouched just beyond the tree line, patient as hunger. He turned from the window. Isabel stood there, face pale but eyes hard. "It will not be long now," she said. And as her words settled into the cabin, Jacob realized the winter storm was not the only siege they would have to endure. The morning rose heavy with silence, the kind that pressed against bone, that warned of men waiting just beyond the timberline. Jacob McGraw stepped outside into snow that reached his knees, the rifle slung tight against his chest, eyes scanning the ridges. The air was sharp enough to cut lungs, the sky bruised with the weight of a storm crawling in. Tracks from the night still scarred the yard, boot prints circling the cabin, lingering, taunting. He knelt to touch one, the edges frozen hard. They had been close, watching, measuring. Isabel stood in the doorway, shawl pulled close, her breath fogging white. She did not ask what he saw. She already knew. Her face, pale but proud, held that brittle steadiness he had come to recognize. A woman who had lived through fire and refused to cower before the ashes. "They'll come soon," Jacob said, his voice low, gravel carried on the cold. "Then we meet them," she answered. He studied her, a flicker of something unspoken tightening his chest. She was not the porcelain figure he had first pulled from ruin. She had hardened like steel tempered by flame. Yet in her eyes lingered the same plea he had heard whispered in the dark nights, not to die alone. He gave a small nod, a promise without words. The day stretched taut. They worked side by side, wordless but attuned. Jacob stacked barrels against the windows, checked powder horns, set axes near the door. Isabel helped roll sacks of grain into place, her breath coming in gasps, her bruises slowing her, but never stopping her. Once, when her strength faltered, Jacob caught her elbow. She pulled away quickly, pride in the gesture, yet her eyes met his with gratitude she didn't speak. By afternoon the sky collapsed into storm. Snow swept down in sheets, rattling against the shutters, howling through the chimney. The wind's roar masked the sound of horses until the first shout cut through, harsh and triumphant. Jacob's gut clenched. They had come. Voices rose outside, rough laughter, the crunch of boots in snow, the stamping of restless mounts. A man called out, his drawl slick with malice. "McGraw, we know you're in there. Hand her over, and maybe we'll let you breathe another day." Isabel stiffened, her fingers tightening around the pistol Jacob had given her. Her lips parted, and he saw the tremor in them before she pressed them firm. Jacob placed a hand on her shoulder, steadying her. Then he turned toward the door. His voice carried calm steel. "Ain't no one leaving here with her." Silence followed, heavy as the storm itself. Then came laughter, the kind that stripped warmth from blood. Gunfire cracked, splinters leaping from the shutters. Isabel ducked, clutching the quilt around her. Jacob dragged her behind the heavy table, flipped it to make cover. Smoke from the fire mingled with powder, thick and acrid. The gang pressed closer, their boots thudding against snow, rifles flashing from tree shadows. Bullets rattled the cabin walls, thudding into logs like fists. Jacob fired through a window slit. One outlaw dropped into the snow with a strangled cry. The rest howled, enraged. The cabin shook under their assault. They tried the door, ramming it, but Jacob had barred it with timber strong enough to hold, at least for a time. Isabel crouched at his side, reloading with trembling but determined fingers. Her hands, so unused to this world, stained with powder now. She whispered something in French, perhaps prayer, perhaps defiance. "They'll burn us out," Jacob muttered, scanning the windows. "Storm's too strong to light it easy, but they'll try." As if answering him, the smell of kerosene wafted in through cracks, sharp and oily. Flames licked against one shutter, sputtering in the blizzard, then catching. Smoke thickened. Isabel coughed, eyes watering, but she did not flinch. She looked at Jacob with fierce steadiness. "If we fall fighting." He almost smiled at her courage, though his chest ached with the weight of it. "We're not falling." Gunfire thundered again. Jacob took aim and shot another shape that moved too close. A scream split the storm. But then a voice rose, deeper, crueler, commanding. Coulter himself. "You've made a mistake, McGraw. That woman's worth more alive than you'll ever see in 10 lifetimes. Step aside, and you can keep breathing." Jacob's reply was a single shot, shattering Coulter's hat clean off. The gang leader cursed, his men shouting, firing blind into the storm. The fight stretched into night. Smoke hung low, choking, but the blizzard fought the flames, smothering them almost as fast as the gang lit them. The storm itself seemed to choose sides. At one point Jacob staggered back, a bullet grazing his shoulder, blood soaking his sleeve. Isabel reached for him, pressing cloth against the wound, her face taut with fear she would not voice. Their eyes locked, and for a moment the world shrank to that single connection, the vow he had given her, the trust she now gave back. When the gang rushed the cabin at last, Jacob stood at the door, firing until his rifle clicked empty. Isabel, voice shaking but hands steady, lifted the pistol and shot a man who burst through the shattered frame. He fell hard, snow clinging to his boots as the storm swallowed him. Her breath came ragged, eyes wide, but she did not crumble. The outlaws faltered, shaken by resistance fiercer than they'd expected. Then Coulter himself strode forward, towering, face scarred, eyes lit with cruel certainty. He kicked the ruined door wide, stepping into the smoke-choked cabin. "Enough!" he roared, rifle leveled. Jacob lunged, tackling him as the shot fired wild. They crashed against the table, splintering wood, fists and fury colliding. Coulter's strength was brutal, honed by cruelty, but Jacob fought with the desperation of a man with nothing left to lose. The struggle turned savage. Blood smeared across the floorboards, the storm screaming through the door. Isabel, trembling but resolute, raised the pistol again. Coulter's knife flashed, glinting as he drew it back to strike. She fired. The sound was deafening in the small cabin. Coulter froze, eyes wide, then slumped heavily to the floor, the knife clattering useless from his grasp. The storm howled through the doorway, carrying away the last of his men's courage. Shouts faded as the gang scattered, fleeing into the white fury. Silence fell, broken only by Isabel's ragged breaths and Jacob's pounding heart. Snow swirled through the doorway, dusting Coulter's still form. Isabel lowered the pistol slowly, her hand shaking uncontrollably now that it was over. Her eyes filled, not with weakness but with the shock of survival. Jacob caught her as her knees buckled, pulling her close, his bloodied arm around her. "You did it," he whispered hoarsely. "You saved us both." She pressed her forehead against his chest, sobs breaking free, muffled in the fabric of his coat. He held her, the fire crackling low, the storm easing at last as dawn light began to edge the horizon. When morning came, the world lay hushed under a new blanket of snow. The storm had buried tracks, covered bodies, left only silence in its wake. Jacob stepped outside, the air sharp but clear, the sky washed pale gold. Isabel followed, wrapped in his quilt, her hair loose, her face still pale but alight with something fierce. She looked out over the ridges, then back at him. "I told you they would not stop. But now, it is done." Jacob studied her, the woman who had arrived broken and near death, now standing taller than the storm itself. He felt something shift inside him, a warmth long buried stirring back to life. She unclasped the locket, opening it for the first time before him. Inside lay a miniature portrait, finely painted, of her father, stern and proud. She held it out, her hand trembling. "All my life, I was the Baron's daughter. Wealth, duty, expectation. But none of that saved me. You did. Not for my name, not for gold. You saved me because it was right." Her eyes shone, steady despite the tears. "I cannot reward you with riches alone. I can only give you myself, if you will have me." Jacob stood in the snow, blood still seeping from his shoulder, the storm's chill biting. Yet warmth flooded him, deeper than fire. He reached, closing her hand around the locket, then drew her gently against him. His lips brushed her hair as he whispered, "That's all I ever needed." They stood together at the cabin's threshold, snow falling soft now, the world remade in dawn light. Behind them, the fire glowed, no longer just his but theirs. Before them stretched a land still harsh, still dangerous, but no longer empty. Sometimes the bitterest winters birthed the warmest homes. Jacob had believed himself hollowed by loss, but love had come again, not by design but by chance, carried through storm and blood. And as the sun rose higher, touching the snow with gold, Isabel lifted her face to his, her voice steady and certain. "We begin anew here, together." Jacob held her close, and in that moment the wilderness felt less merciless, as though the land itself bore witness to a vow sealed not by title or wealth, but by survival, by love found in the bleakest of places. The wind sighed through the pines, carrying away the last echoes of gunfire. The land was quiet again, yet alive with promise. And though the world beyond might one day come calling, for now they had this, fire, snow, and each other, enough to face whatever storms lay ahead.